Welcome to the list of people the entire film set loathed. Today, I present a countdown of the most dangerous and ruthless actresses, women who treated their fans like dirt and their colleagues as expendable fuel for their ambitions. Brace yourself for stories of betrayal, psychological cruelty, and icy indifference that will make even seasoned insiders shudder. If you're not afraid to see the reverse side of the Dream Factory, subscribe now, hit the bell, and leave a like to support our investigation. And don't hold back in the comments. Today, we won't be choosing our words.
Barbara Stanwyck. If you ever wondered whether Hollywood produced a woman with a heart cast from gunmetal, congratulations, you've found her. And her name was Barbara Stanwyck. Forget tenderness or compassion. Stanwyck was forged in the brutal orphanages of Brooklyn, and she carried that survival school straight onto the sound stages of the world's richest studios. She didn't just play strong women. She was a predator who saw colleagues either as tools or as obstacles. They called her the Iron Lady not for resilience, but for her absolute inability to feel empathy. Barbara was a master of refined psychological guerrilla warfare, and her methods would have made even veteran schemers blush. When a young and talented rival appeared on the horizon, Stanwyck didn't throw tantrums. She moved with precision and merciless efficiency, like a professional assassin. The clearest example of her cruelty unfolded during the filming of the noir classic Double Indemnity. Barbara knew that her scene partner suffered from severe panic attacks and deep insecurity. Instead of offering the support expected of a senior star, Stanwyck turned the set into a living nightmare. She colluded with the writers, demanding entire blocks of dialogue be rewritten minutes before the call of action. She took pleasure in the sight of trembling hands and tears welling in the young actress's eyes, systematically dismantling her confidence and provoking failed takes just so she herself could appear flawless by comparison. For Stanwyck, Hollywood was a battlefield where prisoners were not taken and the weak were finished off without hesitation. Her pragmatism bordered on sociopathy. She could maintain the illusion of friendship for years, but the moment someone stumbled or ceased to be useful to her career, Barbara cut them out of her life without the slightest pause. Her personal life was no warmer, staged with the same cold calculation for the sake of image. The much-publicized divorce from Robert Taylor in 1939, sold to the press as a tragic separation of two loving hearts, was in reality the result of her icy strategy. Behind the closed doors of their mansion, she transformed into a fury, intolerant of even the smallest act of defiance. She controlled Taylor as if he were her property, and when he dared to assert his independence, she crushed him emotionally, turning the end of their marriage into a frozen wasteland. She despised sentimentality and considered human feeling a weakness worthy only of contempt. Crews whispered that working with Stanwyck was like walking on thin ice over an abyss. One wrong glance or a command carried out a second too late could cost you your career. She was a tough dame to the core, and that hardness was her primary weapon against a world that had once abandoned her. Barbara Stanwyck did not seek love, she demanded submission. She could publicly humiliate an assistant over the smallest mistake, doing it with such calm and glacial politeness that it was more terrifying than any outburst. Her perfectionism was a form of terror. She forced makeup artists to redo their work dozens of times until the mirror reflected a flawless mask, one that concealed any trace of a living soul beneath it. Stanwyck believed that in this snake pit, only those who strike first survive, and she always struck first, hard and true, without a thought for the damage left behind. Her legacy is not only a gallery of great performances, but also a long trail of shattered lives belonging to those unlucky enough to stand in her way. She departed leaving behind an aftertaste of fear and reluctant respect, never allowing anyone close, because in her world there was no room for closeness, only for war, victory, and the eternal, ringing solitude at the top.
Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich was not merely an actress. She was a high-precision machine engineered to manufacture adoration, with an icy pump pulsing where a heart should have been. If you believed her enigmatic, half-lidded gaze was languor, you were mistaken. It was the look of a predator, calmly calculating how quickly its prey would surrender under pressure. Dietrich elevated perfectionism to the level of absolute terror, turning film sets into her personal labor camp, where she acted as both judge and executioner. For hours on end, with the methodical persistence of a Teutonic knight, she could drive costume designers, makeup artists, and lighting technicians to nervous collapse. For Marlene, there was no such thing as good enough. There was only her vision, for which people were expected to faint from exhaustion. She dissected staff errors publicly with relish, exposing their professional inadequacy before the entire crew and transforming the workday into a prolonged ritual of humiliation. Yet all of this was merely a pale shadow of the darkness she unleashed on those closest to her. Dietrich's true sadism bloomed behind the closed doors of her home, where her daughter, Maria Riva, became not a child, but a living accessory, a projection of her swollen ego. Marlene demanded the impossible from her daughter, to be her flawless second self, stripped of personal will, desires, and even the right to privacy. She forbade Maria from socializing with other children, dismissing them as dirty and primitive, and monitored every breath the girl took, turning her childhood into an endless training drill under the aim of icy blue eyes. Dietrich did not see a human being in her daughter. She saw a tool designed to sustain her legend. And when Maria grew up and attempted to claim independence, Marlene simply froze her out. For years, she ignored her own grandchildren and avoided family gatherings, not out of busyness, but from a pathological fear of aging. To acknowledge the existence of adult grandchildren would have meant admitting her own decline, which for her narcissistic nature was akin to death itself. She chose to erase her own blood from her life so the world could continue believing in her eternal, preserved youth. In love, Dietrich was even a more refined sadist. She played with the emotions of men and women like chess pieces, first cultivating a painful, almost narcotic dependence on her attention, then abruptly turning cold and publicly mocking them for a lack of refinement or feelings that were too ordinary. She was an emotional vampire, feeding on other people's weakness and devotion, while giving nothing in return except the privilege of gazing upon her flawless mask. On the sets of her legendary films, she ruled like a dictator, demanding that lighting crews tape over anything that might cast a wrong shadow on her cheekbones, indifferent to the fact that people worked 20 hours straight without a break for food. Dietrich believed her radiance justified any sacrifice demanded of others. She created a cult of her own personality in which human life, emotion, and dignity were worth less than a perfect stitch on her sequined gown. In the final years of her life, barricaded inside her Paris apartment, she fully transformed into a ghost of her own terror, continuing to command the world through telephone calls while allowing no one to see her aging face. Marlene Dietrich proved that one could be a style icon and still remain an emotional void, a person who spent a lifetime building a temple to herself on the ruins of other people's souls. She departed, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and the bitter aftertaste of betrayal, forever the great and terrible Teutonic diva, for whom love was merely a form of domination and people were disposable materials in her grand spectacle of solitude.
Joan Fontaine. If you ever believed that female solidarity existed in Hollywood, the story of Joan Fontaine will force you to rethink not only that illusion, but your faith in human nature as a whole.
Her life was not merely an acting career. It was a prolonged, brutal psychological thriller in which the ultimate goal was neither fame nor money, but the total annihilation of her own sister, Olivia de Havilland. The Fontaine sisters' feud became legendary, its cruelty surpassing even the darkest Hitchcock screenplay. From early childhood, Joan was saturated with pure, undiluted, poisonous envy, and that feeling became both the fuel for her ambition and a weapon of torture for everyone around her. She could never forgive Olivia for being born first, for being their mother's favorite, for reaching the Hollywood spotlight ahead of her. Fontaine turned her existence into a masterclass in vindictiveness, seizing every opportunity to drive a knife into her sister's back. When Joan won the Academy Award in 1941 for Suspicion, she transformed her moment of triumph into a public execution of family ties. With a cold, deliberate gesture, she ignored the hand Olivia extended to congratulate her, doing so in front of the global press. This was not simply success, it was a decisive victory in a war Joan was waging to erase her sister completely. Her malice knew no moral limits. Joan committed an unprecedented act of betrayal by stealing Olivia's future husband, Brian Aherne, not out of love, but to prove her feminine and professional superiority. She fed on Olivia's failures, blooming whenever her sister suffered. On set, Fontaine behaved like an elegant executioner wrapped in silk. She possessed a rare talent for locating the most vulnerable points in her co-stars' psyches and striking them with short, caustic remarks that quietly dismantled their confidence. Her mastery of poisonous wit left people around her feeling insignificant, while Joan herself maintained the image of a fragile, innocent victim. She was a virtuoso of manipulation, able to present herself as the injured party while secretly holding the stiletto, poised to plunge it into the heart of anyone who dared to rise above her. Family bonds meant nothing to her but chains to be snapped with particular cynicism. At her own mother's funeral in 1975, Joan staged a disgraceful scene, refusing even to stand beside her sister, turning mourning into yet another chapter of her endless struggle for dominance in a hierarchy built on hatred. Later, in her memoirs and interviews, she proudly declared that one could divorce a sister just as easily as a despised husband, and that was exactly what she did, erasing Olivia from her life for decades. In Joan Fontaine's world, there was no room for forgiveness, only debts to be paid in blood and tears. Life, to her, was a zero-sum game. She believed her light could shine only if everything around her was plunged into darkness. Her cruelty was intellectual, cold, and distinctly British. She never descended into shouting, preferring to destroy reputations and minds with a single precise sentence delivered alongside a flawless smile. She remains in history as a great actress whose greatest achievement was not her role in Rebecca, but her reputation as the most vengeful woman in Hollywood, a woman who chose to die in complete isolation rather than take a single step towards reconciliation. Joan Fontaine proved that hatred can be as enduring as granite, and that the most terrifying war of all is the one you wage against your own family, turning every lived day into an act of revenge simply because someone dared to be born before you. Gloria Swanson. Gloria Swanson was not merely the reigning prima donna of the silent film era. She was a natural disaster wrapped in silks and furs, an authoritarian mechanism that crushed the lives and careers of anyone reckless enough to drift into her orbit. In her world, the word no did not exist, and any obstacle standing between her and triumph was subject to immediate annihilation. Swanson possessed a near demonic talent for manipulation, effortlessly turning people into tools for her own advancement.
The most infamous and cynical episode of her life was her affair with Joseph P. Kennedy, the patriarch of a future presidential dynasty. Gloria did not see a man in him. She saw a bottomless wallet, perfectly suited to bankroll her extravagant, wildly unrealistic film ventures. She exploited his money and influence with the cold precision of a seasoned gambler, draining the relationship of every possible dollar just as her own career began to slide with the arrival of sound cinema. When Kennedy, finally grasping the scale of her egocentrism and financial appetite, attempted to end the destructive affair, Gloria did not simply walk away. She detonated a public scandal, accusing him of betrayal and casting him as the villain behind her failures, despite the fact that it was he who had been paying for her pearl-studded gowns and lavish soirees. On set, Swanson ruled as a despot whose whims made producers visibly age overnight. She demanded absolute, total control, reducing directors to obedient puppets. If any actor or crew member dared question her greatness, or worse, threatened to outshine her on camera, Gloria did not settle for reprimand. She destroyed them professionally. Her power in Hollywood was so immense that a single phone call from her could place an unwanted colleague on every major studio's blacklist, ending a career in an instant. She reveled in this authority, wielding it like a blade of punishment. Former lovers who dared to seek happiness elsewhere soon discovered that auditions stopped coming and the doors to producers' offices were closed forever. Gloria did not forgive rejection and tolerated no competition. She lived in a universe with only one sun, herself. Everyone else was merely dust, meant to enhance her radiance. Her egocentrism reached such extremes that she demanded royal treatment even as her fame began to fade. She lived in outrageous, provocative luxury, commissioning outfits whose cost could have funded a small city, while showing absolute indifference to the people who served her. Gloria could dismiss a maid for an improperly folded curtain, or a chef for an insufficiently theatrical breakfast presentation, delivering icy tirades that pushed people to nervous breakdowns. She was utterly deaf to the needs and struggles of others, convinced that the entire world was obliged to adjust itself to her schedule and her moods. When her finances began to crumble under the weight of her refusal to listen to reason, she continued to play the role of a celestial being, stubbornly denying reality. Gloria Swanson remained in the memory of her contemporaries as a magnificent yet lethal artifact of a vanished era, a woman who, to preserve her throne, was willing to burn everything around her to the ground, leaving not even ashes of her opponents. She was a master of destruction, for whom a human fate weighed less than a single carat in her latest diamond necklace, and her cruelty was the direct continuation of her blinding grandeur.
Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn presented herself to the world as a feminist icon, a model of independence, and Hollywood's intellectual aristocrat. But for those unlucky enough to share a set with her, this lady was a natural disaster and a virtuoso of refined psychological sabotage. Her creed was dominance at any cost. If you stood in her way, Katharine didn't simply push you aside. She erased you from the frame with the grace and precision of a surgeon. She didn't just want the leading role, she wanted you to cease to exist as a creative presence as long as she stood in the spotlight. Her methods were subtle, cerebral, and therefore all the more ruthless. During the filming of Pat and Mike, she launched a quiet but relentless war against Judy Holliday, whose rising popularity and talent triggered fits of icy fury in Hepburn.
Leveraging her enormous influence over writers and directors, Katharine reshaped the script behind her colleagues' backs. She systematically cut Holliday's strongest scenes, rewrote dialogue so that the sharpest, most memorable lines flowed into her own mouth, and reduced her rival's role to a pale backdrop for her personal triumph. This was not mere egocentrism. It was a deliberate act of professional annihilation, carried out under the respectable guise of protecting the quality of the film. For Hepburn, the set was a battlefield governed by her rules alone, where basic courtesy and respect for others' work were optional at best. She possessed a chilling ability to paralyze an entire production with her presence. Katharine could halt filming at a critical moment simply to bark publicly and with undisguised contempt at another actress, "Get out of my light. You're interfering with art." That light was sacred to her, and anyone who dared cast a shadow automatically became a personal enemy. Ginger Rogers later recalled her years at RKO with Hepburn as a prolonged nightmare. Katharine systematically forced her out of frame, using her status as management's favorite to impose conditions that left other actresses no room to breathe. She was a master of psychological domination. Her cold, appraising stare and barbed remarks about her co-star's insufficient intellect shattered confidence faster than open shouting ever could. Crews whispered that working with Hepburn felt like surviving a war. If you didn't possess an ego as armored as hers, you were inevitably ground into dust beneath her aristocratic shoes. Her snobbery knew no limits. She considered herself above Hollywood's glitter, yet demanded to be treated like royalty. Katharine openly ignored directors when their vision conflicted with her own, and imposed her will on entire productions, turning collaboration into the servicing of her ambitions. Behind the mask of a progressive woman hid a cold, calculating nature that tolerated no dissent. She expertly cultivated an aura of exceptionality, a belief that she was allowed everything, from humiliating assistants to directly interfering in other people's careers. Hepburn never apologized for her cruelty, dismissing it as honesty. But behind that so-called honesty lay a deep contempt for anyone she did not consider her intellectual equal. By the end of her career, she had become a monument to her own ego, leaving behind a trail of resentment and shattered ambitions belonging to those who once dared to compete with the great Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn proved that high intelligence, when paired with limitless arrogance, can become the most terrifying weapon in the struggle for power, turning art into a tool of domination and the film set into a territory of personal despotism.
Judy Garland, the sweet, fragile Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, singing about rainbows and eternal happiness, was nothing more than a screen-born phantom crafted by studio sorcerers. In reality, Judy Garland was a rolling snowball of unchecked rage that only grew heavier with time, turning the lives of those around her into a relentless exercise in survival. On screen, she embodied vulnerability. Off it, Garland became a capricious and cruel fury whose emotional swings could shatter the career of anyone unfortunate enough to fall under her authority. She reserved a special, almost pathological cruelty for those who could not fight back, her household staff and assistants. To Judy, anyone who drew a paycheck from her ceased to be human. They became convenient targets for the discharge of her accumulated bitterness and frustration. She possessed a chilling ability to destroy lives in passing. Garland could fire a devoted assistant who had served her for years right in the middle of a formal dinner in front of influential guests. The cause could be anything: a bottle of champagne not chilled enough, an incorrect facial expression. She did not simply dismiss people, she did so with calculated cynicism, denying severance pay and issuing recommendations so poisonous that any return to the industry became impossible. Her assistants in the 1960s later described working for her as living in an active war zone, where the rules changed by the minute. Judy could fly into hysterics because the brand of her stockings failed to match her sudden wimp, screaming at staff for hours and pushing them to complete nervous exhaustion. Her despotism took bizarre and disturbing forms. In hotels, she demanded that her assistants stand outside her door for hours on end, fully dressed and alert, forbidden even to step away to use the bathroom until the Queen decided to wake. One of her strangest obsessions was the demand that every mirror in her room be covered with thick black fabric. Woe to the maid who left even the smallest gap. Judy would unleash such violent scenes that hotel management stood ready to call the police. She waged a refined psychological war not only on servants, but on colleagues as well, undermining their confidence moments before stepping onto the stage. Garland was a master manipulator. In the morning, she might swear eternal devotion to an assistant and shower them with expensive trinkets. By evening, she would accuse the same person of theft and throw them into the street with a professional death sentence in hand. She lived in a state of permanent chaos and demanded that the entire world revolve around her endless grievances and whims. Her cruelty often functioned as a form of self-defense, but it was those closest to her who paid the price. Judy Garland turned her life into a one-woman theater in which everyone else was merely scenery, objects that could be broken and discarded at will. Behind her legendary voice hid the temperament of someone who had forgotten how to feel another's pain, consumed entirely by her own. She was a despot who demanded absolute obedience and adoration, responding to loyalty either with icy indifference or bursts of corrosive rage. By the end of her journey, only those willing to endure any humiliation for the sake of proximity to a fading star remained at her side, and even they were crushed beneath her egocentrism. Judy Garland entered history not only as a great singer, but as one of Hollywood's most unbearable and cruel divas, a woman who for the sake of a fleeting whim was willing to annihilate a human fate without blinking, leaving behind only the ruins of human relationships and a lingering trail of unpaid debts and broken hearts.
Zsa Zsa Gabor. If you were looking for Hollywood's purest embodiment of the phrase "from rags to royalty," seasoned with pathological arrogance, Zsa Zsa Gabor is your perfect specimen. This woman didn't merely carry herself like a queen. She genuinely believed that the laws of physics, morality, and the state simply did not apply to her. To Zsa Zsa, the entire world was an enormous runway, and the people around her were, at best, background scenery, and at worst, irritating obstacles to be removed by force or humiliation. Her cruelty was steeped in a toxic, unapologetic class hatred. In 1989, footage of her arrest in Beverly Hills flashed across the globe, showing Gabor calmly slapping a police officer who had dared to pull over her Rolls-Royce. But that scandal was only the tip of the iceberg of her staggering self-importance. The real hell unfolded behind the gates of her estate, where household staff lived under conditions that resembled the ugliest relics of feudalism. Zsa Zsa possessed a perverse talent for stripping people of their dignity. She would force her butler to change outfits 4 or 5 times in a single evening, announcing in front of guests that his livery reeked of poverty. She reveled in her power, making maids scrub carpets by hand simply because the sound of a vacuum cleaner irritated her delicate Hungarian ears. Her cruelty was not impulsive, it was calculated and systemic. Gabor adored psychological sadism, turning her social gatherings into gladiatorial arenas. She deliberately seated sworn enemies at the same table, savoring their discomfort and mocking their reactions in public. If an actress or socialite dared to look better than her, or, heaven forbid, steal even a sliver of media attention, Zsa Zsa launched a full-scale campaign of destruction. Nothing was beneath her. She made anonymous calls to immigration authorities on the staff of her rivals.
She used her connections in city offices to try to have a neighboring actress's beloved dog confiscated on the pretext of improper care. She was a master of petty terror, transforming the lives of those around her into an endless cycle of inspections, fines, and lawsuits. For Gabor, humiliating another person was the only way to confirm her own status as a superior being. She genuinely despised the middle class, viewing ordinary working people as a different biological species, creatures whose sole purpose was to serve her whims without complaint. In Hollywood, she was feared not for her talent, which was modest at best, but for her sharp tongue and total lack of restraint. She could destroy a reputation with a single line spoken live on air, then laugh in her victim's face and say, "Darling, it's just show business." Her attitude toward men was just as cold and utilitarian. She collected husbands the way others collected antiques, draining them of resources and discarding them the moment a more expensive option appeared on the horizon. Somehow, she still managed to portray herself as a victim of male cruelty, all while living in luxury financed by the lives and nerves of her former partners. Zsa Zsa Gabor proved that one could become a tabloid icon without ever performing a single worthy act, and that aggressive ignorance paired with diamonds could blind the public for decades. Behind the mask of a glamorous socialite hid the core of a vulgar and cruel woman who spent her entire life at war with reality and ultimately lost only to her own aging. She departed leaving behind not great roles, but a trail of lawsuits and the memories of servants who recalled their years working for her as the most terrifying nightmare of their lives.
Vivien Leigh. Behind the mask of the delicate, trembling Scarlett O'Hara, the very emblem of Southern femininity, hid a temperament that colleagues on both sides of the Atlantic bluntly described as calculated British cruelty. Vivien Leigh was not merely an actress, she was a surgeon of human emotions who preferred to operate without anesthesia. Her perfectionism was never about self-improvement. It was a refined instrument of torture, a way to assert her absolute superiority over what she considered a talentless majority. During the filming of the legendary Gone with the Wind, Leigh made it clear that for her there was no boundary between role and reality when dominance was at stake. In one scene, she deliberately and forcefully stepped on the hand of Olivia de Havilland, her on-screen counterpart. When Olivia cried out in very real sharp pain, Vivien simply flashed a radiant smile and continued acting, later declaring that it had been necessary for the authenticity of the moment. She took visible, almost physical pleasure in tormenting her colleagues with small but painful acts of cruelty, always served under the elegant guise of high art. Her icy gaze could freeze any assistant in place, and her obsessive demands regarding lighting and makeup turned the lives of technical crews into round-the-clock hard labor, where the slightest mistake was followed by a glacial public dissection in front of the entire set. Vivien's true emotional sadism flourished in her marriage to the great Laurence Olivier. She transformed their union into a prolonged psychological ordeal, wielding her mood swings like weapons of mass destruction. Leigh manipulated Olivier with virtuoso precision, driving him to near frenzy through public flirtations with other men and venomous remarks about his supposedly inferior talent compared to her own. She knew every one of his vulnerabilities and struck them without fail, turning their life together into a cycle of explosive scandals and humiliating reconciliations. If Vivien deemed a fellow actor talentless, she converted their working days into a personal hell. During the filming of Ship of Fools, her chosen victim was Lee Marvin. Leigh relentlessly and methodically mocked his acting technique, his manners, even his appearance, doing so loudly and in full view of the crew. Her cruelty often felt less like a byproduct of her mental illness and more like a calculated, cold-blooded strategy to establish total control on set.
She believed fear was the most effective catalyst for talent and never hesitated to unleash it on those she considered weaker. To Vivien, the people around her were merely extras in her private spectacle of greatness. She could be charming when she wanted something, but once the goal was achieved, the mask dropped, revealing icy indifference. Her sadism lived in the details. She could force costume designers to remake a dress dozens of times, fully aware that the first version had been perfect, simply to watch them wear themselves down. She despised weakness and believed that anyone unwilling to sacrifice everything for her comfort was unworthy of standing in her shadow. By the end of her life, her character had hardened into barbed wire, impossible to penetrate. She remains in history as an icon of style and talent, but those who worked with her behind the scenes remembered only her cold eyes and the frightening ease with which she inflicted pain on others, convinced it was her unquestionable right as a great diva. Vivien Leigh proved that the most terrifying cruelty often hides behind the most beautiful face, and that perfectionism can be nothing more than a socially acceptable way to slowly destroy those around you in service of an insatiable ego. She departed, leaving behind a trail of shattered nerves and memories of a woman who loved the art within herself far more than the people within art.
Ginger Rogers. If you still believe Ginger Rogers was nothing more than the radiant partner of the great Fred Astaire, floating across polished floors in a cloud of feathers, prepare for a hard landing. Behind the scenes, this so-called queen of dance transformed into a ruthless overseer for whom other people's pain was merely collateral damage in her personal pursuit of perfection. Ginger genuinely believed that mediocrity should hurt, and she did everything in her power to make sure those around her felt that truth in their own bodies. Her cruelty was systematic, precise, and deliberate. The main target of her fury was always the chorus line, the nameless dancers meant to serve as a flawless backdrop to her triumph. Rogers possessed an almost frightening memory for other people's mistakes and wielded it as a punitive weapon. She could halt rehearsals for hours just to methodically and publicly tear into a young dancer for a missed beat or an insufficiently pointed toe. These interrogations became full-scale sessions of public humiliation, driving people to hysteria and nervous breakdowns, while Ginger herself remained icy calm, insisting that she was instilling professionalism. Fatigue did not exist in her universe, only her schedule mattered, a timetable with no room for human weaknesses such as hunger or feet rubbed raw and bleeding. Her treatment of the technical crew was no less despotic. She perfected a tactic known as last-minute sabotage, which became her signature move. Ginger could sit through costume fittings for hours, approving every detail, only to erupt into a dramatic tantrum 5 minutes before the call of action, demanding that the bodice be completely redone or the skirt hem altered. She knew she was forcing seamstresses and designers to perform the impossible under extreme pressure, and that knowledge gave her an almost godlike sense of power. When producers attempted to rein her in, pointing out delays and financial losses, Rogers deftly shifted the blame onto those same exhausted workers, accusing them of incompetence and an inability to grasp the star's grand vision. She believed fear was the most effective management tool. Under her rule, the set became a territory of total terror, where people were afraid to so much as breathe in her direction. Her arrogance was so dense that even Fred Astaire, a man famed for his patience, eventually refused to continue working with her. He could no longer tolerate watching his partner torment the crew and turn every shooting day into a combat zone, with Ginger as the sole general who never counted the casualties. Her revenge for even imagined slights was slow and exquisitely cruel. If Rogers felt that a supporting actress was receiving too much light or too much attention from the director, she launched a backstage campaign to destroy the impudent upstart. She used her influence to have competitors' scenes cut or demanded camera angles that made her colleagues look as unflattering as possible. She was a master of psychological suppression, creating a vacuum around herself in which only the most obedient and spineless sycophants could survive. Ginger Rogers remains in history as a symbol of grace, but those who witnessed the underside of that glitter knew that every flawless pirouette was paid for with tears and broken wills, hundreds of them left outside the frame. She proved that talent can serve as the perfect camouflage for profound personal cruelty, and that the roar of applause can easily drown out the cries of those an icon uses as living steps toward her throne. Ginger departed, leaving behind a legend of effortless dance that concealed a heavy, merciless engine of ego, one that knew no compassion for enemies, friends, or even the very idea of human empathy.
Veronica Lake. If you thought noir was merely a film genre, then you never encountered Veronica Lake, a woman who brought impenetrable darkness into every soundstage she ever set foot on. Her nickname, the Peekaboo Bitch, was not a cruel invention of bored journalists. It was a collective verdict delivered by an entire industry that shuddered at the sound of her name. Lake was living proof that behind an otherworldly, almost elfin beauty can lurk the temperament of a marketplace bully fused with the refined sadism of a professional troll. Her cruelty was not grand and theatrical like Dietrich's. It was petty, sticky, and omnipresent, like shards of broken glass inside a shoe. Veronica possessed an almost supernatural instinct for other people's insecurities and struck them with sniper precision. The most vivid example of her pettiness was her relationship with her frequent screen partner, Alan Ladd. Lake knew perfectly well that the rugged leading man was deeply insecure about his short stature, a fact that forced cinematographers into constant visual gymnastics. And what did sweet Veronica do? She deliberately wore the tallest heels imaginable, and during breaks loudly and publicly mocked Ladd, suggesting he stand on a vegetable crate so he could reach her eye level. She savored his humiliation, watching him flush beneath layers of makeup, and continued her torment until he was on the verge of an emotional breakdown just moments before the call of action. Her attitude toward other actresses was soaked in such thick, pathological jealousy that it bordered on madness. Lake turned the sabotage of other people's work into her favorite pastime. One of her preferred tricks was to move deliberately during close-ups of other actresses, throwing off focus or forcing retakes just as a rival delivered her strongest emotional performance. She could torture costume designers for hours with endless demands for alterations, only to receive the perfect outfit and then accidentally spill hot coffee or red wine all over it moments before stepping onto the set. This was not clumsiness. Veronica reveled in the sight of costumers panicking in tears, trying to save the dress while working unpaid overtime with no hope of compensation. She despised the labor of little people, viewing them as nothing more than background scenery for her whims. The most shocking expression of her contempt for others, however, was her personal hygiene, or rather, its complete absence. Hollywood was rife with legends that Lake could be smelled from a distance, as she pointedly ignored bathing altogether. Her partners in love scenes were said to suffocate in her embrace, and Gilbert Rowland later recalled that kissing the style icon felt like diving headfirst into a trash bin. This was her form of protest against the system, but it was ordinary people who paid the price, forced to endure her stench and her venomous remarks for 14 hours a day. Veronica Lake was a master of psychological terror, which she disguised as a difficult personality. She could derail a multi-million-dollar production simply because she disliked the tone used by a lighting technician, demanding his immediate dismissal and public apologies from the entire studio. By the end of the 1940s, virtually every living soul in Hollywood despised her, from Paramount executives to the last janitor. Her career collapsed not only because fashions changed, but because no one was willing to breathe the same air as her anymore. She ended her days in cheap hotels, working as a waitress under an assumed name, still snapping at customers and despising the world that had rejected her. Veronica Lake remains a cautionary tale of what happens when someone mistakes popularity for the right to unchecked cruelty. She was the peekaboo bitch to the very end, a woman who chose to burn every bridge and remain utterly alone rather than admit that the people around her were human beings too, not props for her endless, rotten manipulations. And with that, our list comes to an end, and after stories like these, it is hard to deny that old Hollywood will never look quite the same again.
We have passed through 10 circles of Hollywood hell, tearing down the gold-embroidered curtains from the lives of those the world once held up as icons of grace, talent, and nobility. And what remains when the spotlights fade and the makeup is washed away along with the fake smiles? What stands before us is not a gallery of goddesses, but a parade of broken, cruel, and profoundly unhappy women who turned their fame into a weapon of mass destruction. We saw how Barbara Stanwyck forged her success from steel and other people's tears, how Marlene Dietrich methodically destroyed her own daughter to preserve the myth of eternal youth, and how Veronica Lake drowned the remnants of her career in petty malice and contempt for everyone around her. These stories are not just a collection of dusty archival gossip, they are a harsh reminder that Hollywood's so-called golden age was built on a foundation of total egocentrism and emotional cannibalism. For decades, the studio system shielded these monsters in skirts, feeding us fairy tales about delicate violets and strong-spirited ladies, while behind the scenes, careers were shattered and human lives splintered into debris. It turns out that behind the perfect frame, there was often real terror, beaten children, humiliated assistants, betrayed friends and colleagues whose names were erased from history simply because they dared to cast a shadow on a star's greatness. We have seen that talent is not a pardon, and it does not grant the right to turn other people's lives into a battlefield. High art as practiced by these women was often nothing more than a screen for a deep inner emptiness they tried to fill with power, money, and the suffering of others. Our journey behind the scenes of old Hollywood is over. Now, when you revisit the classic films, you will see not only the sparkle in their eyes, but also the icy darkness hidden behind their legendary images. Remember this, no Oscar and no minute of worldwide fame is worth the price paid by those who stood in the path of these destructive ambitions. Let these stories serve as a lesson that true beauty begins where egoism ends, and that real greatness is impossible without at least a trace of human compassion. Write in the comments which name on this list disappointed you the most, and whose films you will never be able to watch the same way again. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this honest investigation, and remember, there are still plenty of skeletons in Hollywood's closets waiting for their moment. See you in future episodes, where we will continue dragging into the light those who hid for far too long in the shadow of their own fame.